Tell us how you became interested in working with found footage. You come from painting, so your background is it's kind of defining of why you made a film like this.
I started out as a painter, and I was studying painting at Cooper Union, and my film professor was the great animator Robert Breer. So very early on, I started understanding I could do both paint and make films that felt like paintings, and then I realized that it was very hard to get people to sit in front of a painting for 2 hours. So I switched over to film, and but I really thought about the materiality of film, how it can change over time, and how the duration of viewing can somehow parallel the history of a given piece of film. So very early on, I was first distressing individual photographs or cells to get sort of similar effect to what you saw, and then I understood that nature could do that in an interesting way, and when nature did that, there was usually a story behind it. So maybe 20 years ago or more, 20 years before I made this film, I made a short film about the paper print collection, which is a primitive film collection, the first 16 years of our recorded film history, so ancient in fact that it predated any copyright law, and these original nitrate prints were saved as paper rolls as copyright deposits, and eventually they were being thrown out, and a clerk intervened and saved them, and eventually they were returned to film so that we could have a record of that. And ironically, we have a pretty good record of the first 16 years of filmmaking, unlike everything after 1912, when there was already a Copyright Act and you didn't need to do this arcane thing of saving a paper roll. We lost a lot of our silent film collection, as this film makes painfully clear. So that was in some ways the same type of story, or the same type of approach that I thought I could do with Dawson City. And around the same time, maybe when I was still in art school, and this was a relatively fresh story, I guess it was maybe 10 years old at the time, it was still a story that was repeated, in, at least amongst people who were interested in old film or archival film. And so I remember hearing about this and just kind of wondering who would want to have a swimming pool in the Yukon to begin with, you know? And then the idea that there was film sprayed in there always just boggled the mind. Many years later, I was offered this opportunity to show another film of mine, Decasia, in Ottawa, and the programmer who invited me there said, "Oh, by the way, I work at Libraries and Archives Canada," and I said, "Well, and you'd be welcome to come see what I do and see what our collection holds." And I said, "Well, don't you hold the Dawson City collection?" And indeed they did. And not only that, they were getting a 4K scanner installed. So I understood that maybe the time had come to tell this story in the same way I told this earlier film.
It seems to me, as I said before, to me this movie is much more than the story of this of these prints, and it's a story about this country. It's a story about the rush to the West, and it's the most. It is the most narrative so far that you have had in your work. So I'm kind of curious, how did you? I've seen several versions when you were editing of this, but how did you find your way through this multiple narrative and the thing about the footage, the thing about the gold rush and the.
Well, I was hoping that, of course, I didn't know what the story would be when I began. I just thought that this was an incredibly rich and ironic story, and that there would be this footage that was buried in a swimming pool, so that it would be. I was familiar with the look, what archivists call the Dawson flutter, this kind of these white tentacles on the side of the frame, and I knew that. Which
is because of the weight of.
I think, well, it's probably water damage. The successive thaws. There's also a theory that all that film was in pretty good shape until they took it out in 1978, and it sat around in Dawson all summer before the pros got a hold of it. But anyway, that's a very distinct marking that no other collection has. Most nitrate film collections deteriorate from heat, and they dry out. And this one was actually stored in an incredibly a great facility, a frozen swimming pool. The problem was the water damage. But at any rate, I thought that if I got a hold of this collection, I could start figuring out what it held and and the idea would be to try to tell the story ostensibly with the collection, and then allow myself the lateral movement to branch out. One key fact I knew going in was that the gold was discovered in 1896 in Dawson, which you can argue was the beginning of public exhibition of cinema. So using the beginning of cinema and the end of the rainbow, as it were, the end of a time when indigenous people could use that area as a camping ground, were dovetailed, and that cinema could in this way represent expansion, colonialism, capitalism, and would be a tentacle with which you could explore the history of the town. And that fell into place quite nicely. We went up to Dawson, I guess it would have been Labor Day weekend of 2014, sort of on a fact-finding mission, and it was talking to a museum curator there that I understood all of the connections to Hollywood, which I didn't know going in. And then some of those were bore out in the collection itself, some of the same filmmakers and presenters, and certainly in the history of Hollywood. So there was a way that we could make cross sections there, but it was like a massive jigsaw puzzle, which is sort of a cliched way of talking about making a film, but in this case, it really is like that. You have all these little pieces of film, and you're trying to figure out where the edge is, so you put the edges in first, and then there's spots that I really wanted to tell and that I knew must exist, but I needed some sort of visual or historic evidence for it, and those holes eventually got filled. One of which, of course, was just I theorized that the reason why a lot of this stuff was expendable is because so much of silent film was expendable once the talkies came along, and it was especially in the early 30s. It was like, I don't know, what we would think of watching a VHS now or something. It wasn't done. Technology had moved forward. You had this huge leap of storytelling with the talkies, and to watch a silent film, nobody was going to spend a dime on that. So once it took, Dawson City a few years to get a system installed, but once it was there, nobody wanted the highly flammable films lying around. And so finding that newspaper article that said we dumped it in the river, we made a bonfire, that was a hole that I'd left there, and that was going to link this historic time of when the films were made to the modern time when the films were found. And almost most incredibly, I think, was the story of the Eric Haig's photographs and how they were found in that cabin, which was sort of a mythological story. It had been accounted for in two different sources, though nobody had any details on it. It was a woman had found these glass plate negatives in her cabin, and she really wanted to make a greenhouse, and so she swapped them for clean plates and with her boss, but it was so vague that I knew I couldn't include it in the account the way I was doing it. So you had to have a face, you had to have a date, you had to have a name. It would have sort of been a red herring to have this hearsay story in the middle of the, especially one that was so important to the telling of the story. So I left that as another hole. And over the course of making this film, I became quite chatty with Kathy Gates, who you see interviewed, who speaks at the end of the film, really. And I had a lot of late night emails with her, or at least they were late night from me. And she's in the Yukon. And I said to her, there's this thing bothering me about these Eric Hegg glass plate negatives, because sometimes there's 200 of them and sometimes there's 2,000 of them, and nobody says who the woman is who's found it or who her boss was or where she worked. And so she said, oh yeah, well there's a gal in town who we always complain about people getting Yukon history wrong, so let me just give her a call. And she called up her friend Irene, and Irene was like, oh yeah, that was me. So that was a mystery solved. One phone call. All of a sudden, we had her name, we had her photographs, and her name of her boss, and everything to back up that story. So there was this idea of like trying to get to link these things, but I guess the overarching system was that time is so weird as it is. If you told something chronologically, there will be these tendencies for things to loop back, and things will come back and resurface. And it was a film. It was a film about, if nothing else, resurfacing. So I sort of thought of it as an archaeological dig in and of itself. That we would start with this very banal surface imagery of this interview with me and a baseball commentator, the type of show you could see in a bar, and then from there we'd go deeper into, I guess, the 1970s, and from there to the very beginning of cinema, the creation of celluloid, and then sort of work our way back up to the surface again.
Question? There's one there.
What was your thought in editing the different clips, that you came back to some of the same films with a different part of them at a different point in your production?
Yeah, I mean, there was something like 324 titles that were recovered, and I used about a third of those. I hadn't watched all of them, but those were the ones that in some way told the story best, whether it was imagery or there was a recurring theme, and so there were favorites, and I liked that you would keep coming back to them, and that certain ones held more meaning. I think somebody else could take the same collection and tell a completely different story, but those were the ones that grabbed me, I guess.
Can you give us an idea of the amount of footage that you went through, the mass of things to get to a 120-minute film?
Yeah, I mean, well, what was great is that when they got that 4K scanner, I eventually could just ship 12 terabyte drives up there and say, I want all of it, basically. Some of it wasn't ready to go. In the years since I've released the film, I now have all the newsreels, which I didn't have at the time. And the newsreels I really found the most fascinating. But so, I don't know, if each reel is 10 minutes, and there was, so you can figure, I don't know, something like 100 hours of footage. I think I had, I don't know, easily 20 hours of footage that on my drives that I was dealing with, that had been selected either by title or by description or some clue, whether it mentioned gold or swimming or something. Somehow there was some way that I thought it could tell my story, and but also just as I started to understand what the story was more, then I was starting to look for the history of anarchy or radical politics in this country, and as that became a theme that was drawn out from the footage.
What was the time period from conception to completion?
It was roughly, I mean, I think that from conception, I would say probably 4 years. But really from that first trip to Dawson City, research trip, to premiering it in Venice, it was just exactly 2 years. Yeah, and really I'd have to say that it was 1 year where everything was coming together. There's a lot of getting your palette together, and then finally when everything's in place, you can figure out where it goes and most importantly what you're missing. You know.
Would it be correct to assume you didn't have any copyright problems because they were so old?
Certainly with all the footage that was from the swimming pool itself, that was no problem.
It's all expired.
Yeah, that's all. There's a 90-year copyright law, and most of that stuff wasn't renewed anyway. Most of those studios don't even exist, you know. So, but there is other footage there that I needed to license, so it wasn't completely scot-free. You know.
How many of the feature films, obviously these films, some of them are multiple reels, were there any that were actually found intact where there were 7 reels, it was all fragments?
It was all fragments, and in some ways I think that's led to why this story was this discovery was in some ways marginalized. I mean, I think initially when this big trove of nitrate film was found, there was hopes and dreams that, Cleopatra would be, some of these great lost, the white whales of silent filmmaking would finally be brought into harbor. But that was not the case. And, seldom did you find more than 2 reels of a 7-reeler. And those reels were pretty severely damaged. And, they did help out with other productions if somebody was missing a reel 2 in some cases. I think there were things that filled in. But, archivists like things nice and clean. The idea would be to show a beautiful restored print in a big fancy setting. And they don't all share my aesthetic. That they're beautiful the way they are.
The footage of Bleckman, was that a random find when that the bit of Ellis Island where those immigrants are being deported? I mean, it's astounding to me. I mean, was that identified in any way, or did you just eye that as being him?
I eyed it, yeah.
Remarkable.
And in fact, you can make out the shape of Emma Goldman behind him. But
just astounding, yeah.
That is incredible. Thank you for
absolutely
noticing.
Lovely film.
Thank you.
Eric?
Yeah, I am. First of all, started the movie off with that the cinema was born of explosives,
Yeah.
and end with the salamander being the thing that can live through fire. And
Yeah.
stuff. That was beautifully poignant in that way. I was curious.
And poignant, especially for this community.
Were you at all interested in the movies themselves, the full narrative of the movies? Did you research that? Or was it really just the fragments and the visual effects that you used to tell your own?
Yeah, this was not a dive into those films per se, and I think
do they exist in terms of like you could find out the lady from the circus or whatever?
Oh yeah, Polly of the Circus.
Polly
Yeah.
of the Circus, you could find out what that story actually is.
Yeah, that you can find that out. That's though a complete print doesn't exist. There are synopses on IMDb, for instance, of that. Yeah. And that became an important film because it dealt with fire and a lot of the imagery that's pulled to represent this film is from that one. But yeah, I was interested in the historicity of these clips. What they represented as time more than the stories that they once told.
Can you tell us a little bit about why Charlie Chaplin was in the films?
Oh, well, I mean, I guess, can you rephrase your question? He was a huge star back then.
Yeah, but it was a real movie. I mean, everybody saw that Gold Rush.
Right.
And what?
Okay,
how
so-
did you think of that in relationship to the?
To this story?
Yeah, to
Okay.
the story that you told.
Because Charlie Chaplin's Gold Rush was based on the Klondike Gold Rush, the story that is the setting for this entire discovery. I believe Mary Pickford showed Chaplin Eric Hegg's photographs as a stereogram, and he was inspired to make the Gold Rush, which came out in 1925. So I used that film several different ways. First, to tell the story of the Gold Rush, which happened 30 years earlier. So where the tramp is one of the people who are actually making their way to Dawson City, and then again when 1925 rolls around, the timeline of my film, it's one of the films that is being premiered at Sid Grauman's theater, and Sid Grauman actually did an intro because, of course, he was a favorite son of Dawson City. So it's connected in two different ways. It's telling the story that's the background of this story, and it's also part of film history that intercepts this same timeline.
I think what was confusing for me was I didn't know which was the movie of Charlie Chaplin and which were the things that you found.
Oh, well, I mean, there isn't any footage of the Gold Rush per se, except for that Edison footage, which sort of comes afterwards when they've already established gold mining, and the cameras come up there. But the still photographs, Eric Hegg was on the scene there at the time, and he was documenting that Gold Rush in still photographs. And there wasn't any 35 millimeter production team there making a movie, but that's a reenactment that took place in California some, like I said, 29 years later. And that production was based on Hegg's photographs, so those things should have matched. Some of those angles are the same, and I played with that Chaplin was looking at Hegg, and that I was bringing you up through Hegg, and then segueing into Chaplin to tell that story. And then it was supposed to work as a visual gag that you were in this realistic setting, and then Charlie Chaplin walks in on, from the left of the frame. Supposed to get a chuckle. Did you think it was funny?
It was funny.
Okay, thank you.
I thought it was great research. I wanted to ask you about the film reels that you said that you have just still been going through, that you
Yeah.
hadn't had a chance to work with. Do you have access to? Oh, before I do that though, the footage of the avalanche.
Right.
That is in the Klondike, right? I mean,
Well, that was,
where did
again, that
come
was
from?
the Trail of 98, which was a 1928 feature.
Okay.
So these were both, Gold Rush and Trail of 98 were looking back at the Gold Rush as a setting for a narrative film that took place, 30
Curious
years
about
ago.
that. But then, so if you have more of these newsreels to work with, they must love you, having made this beautiful film up in Ottawa. So can you have access to newsreels? Could you do more with, because the whole cross-cutting thing that you were doing, the implied cross-cutting with the treatment of laborers and oligarchs and today, and thank you for the bit about Trump's.
Everyone loves that one.
Like, that was also excellent. Do you have any inclination to work with?
Yeah, I mean, I love this footage, and
newsreels?
it's remarkably, it took place exactly 100 years ago. Like, the real sweet spot of that collection is 1919 and 1920. For instance, a suffragist exhibit in Staten Island contacted me last week, and it's like, can we show, do you have any footage that you've collected? Like, I'd posted one of a 12,000 woman march. They said, can we have that clip? And I was like, yeah, but I also have these, other dozen suffragist clips that I've pulled. Would you like those also? And they were like, yes. So it's been, it's interesting how the news worked back then, because I feel like the soul of the country was still up for grabs, and
I think it still is.
I hope you're right. But at the same time, I think that the news was very much controlled by corporate interests. And back then, workers were going to the movies and wanted to hear stories about other workers. And it would be very hard to find, a protest in Union Square like that represented in the same way today.
Well, among all the other things that this film is, it's an archival tour de force. I mean, just the way that you put it together so that it has, without it being a hammer approach, it's just a really beautifully delivered archival meditation. So,
Thank you.
thanks.
I ditto everything. I mean, it was so spectacular, and it just fulfills what you have been doing and Sag Harbor Cinema has been doing, just bringing back. I mean, with Sarah, I couldn't stop thinking about Cinema Paradiso, and the volatility of this medium and what has survived. One thing I was curious about is it seemed that a lot of the footage, the newsreel footage, not the silent film footage, was shot in spring or summer. I mean, we think of the Yukon as, the avalanche and snow. Is that because it was more reasonable to shoot? I mean, the indoor pool when they were playing hockey was indoor.
Yeah.
You didn't see a lot of, except for Charlie Chan, a lot of snow shots.
Right. There were some. I was mostly interested in the city shots. There was a lot of caribou shots that I left on. I couldn't even say on the editing room floor. They didn't get imported. And you have to remember that the days are very short up there in the winter. There isn't a lot of light. But I was really interested, and very cold too. And I was really interested in any shots of the city, photographs or and the city really was a place where people refueled, restocked their supply, went for entertainment, and went back on the mine. There wasn't, the only commerce there was to serve the miners. So it was the town in the sense that it was a hub and a resource center, but not much else.
One more quick thing, since I still have this mic. Was there a time, an average time that a silent film was made, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour? What kept the people engrossed? And there were obviously newsreels before this.
Right. So, I think back then a big feature would have been 9 reels, and that you can roughly figure 10 minutes per reel. So, but as you say, the programs went on. There was a short, there was a newsreel, and they built this thing. I was amazed. I read a lot of the page 4 of the Dawson City News, which had the local listings, and then it also had all the local stories. So I would pore over that stuff and really go down rabbit holes. If anyone's looking for material, look at page 4 of the Dawson City News. But at any rate, how many, at one point during the heyday, they'd had 4 or 5 different buildings operating as cinemas, and they would change their program 3 times a week, so it was really just amazing how the sheer number of titles that went through there per week. I think there was precious little else to do,
Can you talk a little bit about the soundtrack for the film? Because it was very unusual, and I'm just sort of curious about your choices there.
So the sound was composed, the music was composed by Alex Summers, who's I came in contact with. He was worked closely with the Icelandic band Sigur Rós, and they were fans of an earlier film of mine called Decasia. So they contacted me, and I ended up working with Alex on this, which was something of a leap of faith. I knew he and his partner, who's the frontman of Sigur Rós, Jónsi, had put out this beautiful record in 2009 called Rice Boy Sleeps, and it was very ethereal and had beautiful. It just felt very evocative and transportative, and that's sort of what I wanted this to feel. And they loved the idea of damaged film and sort of this music box kind of approach to opening up a tomb of films and finding what was inside. He had, I guess he'd made Captain Fantastic at that time, and since then he's got a real string going now of indie films that he's scored. The Hale County this evening, the Honey Boy, and a couple others. At any rate, my process with him was to send him an edit, and he was in Reykjavik, and I was either in New York or out here in Riverhead, and he would send an edit back, and I would make notes, and we'd go back and forth. And he brought in his brother John, who sort of made the Foley or the sound effects that are very closely linked to what Alex had scored, so that they're even in the same key, It behaves for you.
It behaves, yeah. No, but you've been working with the juxtaposition between contemporary music and
that's true.
That's predates Dawson. You also do live shows with.
That's true. I mean, music. Almost all my films are front to back music, so the relationship with the composer and the soundtrack is very important.
And with this, I want to really thank Bill for being here.
Thank you.
Sharing the
Thanks,
film.
Giulia.
And thank you for coming.